He walked out of his garage on a Tuesday evening in rural Ohio, and nobody saw him again for 29 years. No body. No car on a roadside. No withdrawal from his bank account. Mike Markham simply stopped being a thing the world could locate. And for nearly 3 decades, that was the whole story. A man who built something strange in a cinder-block garage, made a few late-night calls to a radio show, and then vanished, so completely that even the people who loved him eventually stopped expecting an answer. That was strange enough, but then he came back. And what he brought with him, journals, diagrams, and an explanation that has no comfortable shelf to sit on, makes the disappearance itself feel like the least unsettling part of what happened. The journals are handwritten in a style entirely consistent with the 1990s. The most recent entry is dated 3 weeks ago. So before we get to what he claims happened, there is a more fundamental question sitting underneath all of it. Who exactly is this man, and where in any meaningful sense of the word has he been? Mike Markham was not a scientist by any credential the word usually implies. He had no degree, no lab, no institutional affiliation of any kind. What he had was a public library card he used aggressively, a subscription to 3 fringe physics newsletters that came in plain envelopes, and a quality that people who knew him in Portage County, Ohio, kept reaching for the same word to describe: relentless. Not passionate, not enthusiastic, relentless. He had grown up the kind of kid who took apart appliances not to see how they worked, but to argue with how they worked. By his late 20s, in the early 1990s, he was reading everything he could find on torsion fields, on scalar waves, on the handful of researchers who'd been quietly defunded or quietly ignored after publishing results that didn't fit the accepted model. He was convinced, and he said this out loud often, that mainstream physics wasn't wrong exactly. It was just incurious, that it had stopped asking the questions that mattered. A neighbor who lived 2 properties over remembers a conversation over a fence one autumn evening. Markham told him, without any apparent irony, that the reason clocks tick forward is not physics, it is habit. And habits, he said, can be broken. What specific chain of reasoning, or obsession, or desperation led a man to wire up high-voltage equipment inside a cinder-block garage in rural Ohio and actually throw the switch is the question that pulls at everything else. He threw the switch because he had convinced himself the math demanded it. That much, at least, is consistent across every account. The garage sat behind a rented property on County Road 7, cinder-block walls, a corrugated metal roof that drummed in the rain. Neighbors described a smell, ozone mostly, the sharp electric bite of it, that would drift across the fields on still nights. Inside, Markham had built something that looked less like a laboratory than like a salvage yard, given a purpose. The centerpiece was a Jacob's ladder rig, 2 copper rails about a meter apart, feeding off a transformer stack he pulled from a decommissioned industrial unit. Arc after arc would crawl up the gap, snapping, branching, climbing until it broke and the next one formed below. Around it, hand-wound toroidal coils, capacitor banks bolted to a plywood frame, a timing circuit he'd designed himself and revised at least 11 times according to the journal entries that survived. The early anomalies were small, a screwdriver not where he'd left it, a compass needle that spun rather than settled, a wall clock that ran 17 minutes slow after a full power test, then kept perfect time afterward, as if it had simply stumbled and recovered. And then there was the coffee mug. One witness, a man who helped Markham run power to the garage, says he placed a full mug on the workbench before a test late one evening. The next morning, 14 hours later, the coffee was still hot. Not warm, hot. The question that no one has cleanly answered is whether any of this was real, documented, measurable, reproducible, or whether it was the feedback loop of a man who had already decided what he was going to find. That question, real or self-constructed, becomes a lot harder to dismiss when you look at what Markham himself wrote down. Because he kept records, not just of readings and voltages, but of things that went missing. A 3/4-inch combination wrench, noted absent in a handwritten inventory dated spring of 1991. A single page torn from an earlier logbook, not removed cleanly, not lost in a move, but gone while the logbook sat locked in a metal cabinet Markham had welded shut himself. And a photograph. The photograph is the one that stops you. It was the only print of an image of Markham himself. Not a copy, not a duplicate on a contact sheet, just gone. As if whatever was happening inside that garage had developed a specific preference for erasing evidence that he had ever been there at all. In his notes, Markham didn't call these losses. He called them adjacencies, his word for objects he believed had slipped into what he described as a parallel temporal register, not destroyed, displaced, present somewhere, just not in the same one. Whether you accept that or not, a pattern is there. Small, dense, personally significant objects. Things that anchor a person to a place and a time. Which forces a question. Is that a coherent mechanism pointing towards something testable? Or is it pointing towards something far less comfortable than physics? Whether the disappearances were genuine physical events, or the selective memory of a man under enormous psychological strain, the record Markham left behind treats them as data. And data, even unreliable data, has a shape. Data has a shape. And in late 1994, that shape started broadcasting on AM radio after midnight. Coast to coast AM was the right frequency for a story like this. Art Bell ran it like a confessional booth for the technically obsessed, engineers, insomniacs, people who'd seen something they couldn't file anywhere else. The audience didn't mock, they listened. And sometime in the fall of 1994, a man calling himself Mike from Ohio started calling in. The early calls were almost dry. He described the Jacob's ladder setup, the power draws, the objects he'd placed in the field. He used the word displacement before he used the word vanish. He sounded like someone being careful with language, not because he was performing credibility, but because the wrong word felt genuinely wrong to him. By the third call, the carefulness was fraying. He described a sensation he kept returning to, that after long sessions near the device, familiar things felt indexed rather than experienced. His own kitchen, his own handwriting, recognized, but not felt. And then the final call. The voice that identified itself as Mike said quietly, with no particular drama, "I don't think I'm synchronized anymore." And the line went dead mid-sentence. What he meant by synchronized, and whether anyone heard his voice again after that night, is the question the next 30 years of this story tries to answer. The spring of 1995. Neighbors remember the date loosely, sometime in April, maybe early May, because the garage light had been running continuous for weeks, and then one morning it wasn't. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Not Markham himself, the light. A woman who lived 2 houses down told a researcher years later that she'd seen him walking toward the garage the previous evening, around dusk. He was carrying something under his arm. She couldn't say what. She didn't think to look twice. He walked in, and the door closed behind him, and that was the last confirmed sighting of Mike Markham anyone on record has ever given. By the following morning, the garage was empty. The device was cold. Not warm, not residually humming, but cold in the way a room gets when nothing has run in it for a long time. His car was still in the driveway. His wallet was on the workbench. The journals were gone. The local sheriff filed a missing persons report. Routine paperwork for a man with no family pressing the issue and no evidence of foul play. But buried in that report is a single detail that got almost no attention at the time. The investigating deputy noted, almost as an afterthought, that there were footprints in the dust on the garage floor, leading in toward the center of the room, none leading out, and the door had been locked from the inside. How does a man lock a door from the inside and then vanish without leaving? That question sat in a file drawer for 3 decades. Whether Markham walked out of that room voluntarily, or whether something happened in there that no standard investigation had the vocabulary to document. That remains exactly as open now as it was the morning the light went out. That file drawer held the question for 29 years. Not because anyone was protecting it, because nobody cared enough to keep pulling it back out. The sheriff's office closed Markham's case as an open missing persons file in the administrative sense only. No investigation was ongoing. No detective was assigned. The paperwork existed to satisfy a bureaucratic requirement, not because anyone expected Mike Markham to walk back through a door. A man with no spouse, no children, no employer filing a complaint. A man who had, by most accounts, already been drifting away from ordinary life for years before he finished drifting out of it entirely. The community didn't mourn. It moved on the way small communities do, by slowly replacing the story with other stories. For most of the 90s, Markham was a local oddity at best. The kind of thing an old-timer might mention to a newcomer over coffee. The way you mention any piece of local color. Strange fellow. Built something in his garage, then he was gone. End of story. But the internet changed the half-life of strange stories. By the mid-2000s, fringe forums had discovered Markham, or what little of him could be found. Scattered references, third-hand accounts. Someone who'd heard, someone who'd met him. Sometime around 2010, one thread tried to compile everything. Every documented account, every name, every date. It gathered dozens of replies over several months, and then it was gone. No cached version. No archive. As if it had simply ceased to exist. Whether that's coincidence or something else is a question nobody has been able to answer cleanly. The thread vanishing without a trace. That was 2010. 14 years later, something stranger happened. Not online. In person. In the spring of 2024, a man walked into a small county in rural Ohio. He was older, visibly, undeniably older. But to the two people who had known Markham personally and were still alive to say so, the face was consistent. The build. The particular way he held himself. He was carrying a canvas bag. Inside it, journals. Dozens of them. He didn't announce himself. He didn't go to a newspaper or a camera crew. He went, of all places, to the county sheriff's office, and he gave them his name, Mike Markham. The deputy on duty ran it. There was a hit, not a missing persons flag, not a warrant. A speeding ticket from 1987, the last bureaucratic fingerprint the state of Ohio had ever taken from him. They asked if he'd submit to a voluntary print comparison. He agreed without hesitation. They matched. Conclusively. The man standing in that office was the same man who had been cited for doing 54 in a 35 on Route 40, 37 years earlier. So the question the internet had spent a decade half asking suddenly had weight behind it. If the prints match, if this is genuinely him, then where was he for 29 years? And what is written in those journals? 11 notebooks. That's what he brought. Not a hard drive, not a stack of loose papers, not a thumb drive with encrypted files. 11 composition notebooks, the kind you'd find in any drugstore. Their covers warped and water-stained, the spiral binding on two of them nearly pulled free. They were handed over to the investigative team in a plastic grocery bag. Roughly chronological, though not perfectly. The early volumes are the most legible. Dense, cramped handwriting alongside technical diagrams that the team described as precise enough to suggest genuine engineering training. Circuit layouts, resonance frequency annotations, what appears to be shielding geometry for a high-voltage coil arrangement. Markham, whoever he is, clearly understood the hardware he'd been building. But somewhere around the fourth notebook, the character of the writing changes. The diagrams don't disappear. They get more elaborate, more urgent, but they begin sharing pages with something else. Personal narrative that isn't quite personal narrative. Sentence fragments. Lists of observations that cut off mid-thought. Dates recorded and then scratched out and rewritten. One of the later journals has 47 pages in clear sequence, numbered, undisturbed. But the content jumps, not by a day or a week, by what the researchers estimated, based on contextual references inside the text, could be several months between consecutive numbered pages. No notation of the gap. No explanation. Just a new entry beginning mid-thought, as if no time had passed at all. So the journals answer one question. Yes, he was recording something, continuously. Across the years, he was gone. But they open a harder one immediately. Are those missing intervals blank time, unrecorded stretches where nothing happened? Or is there something more disturbing in the idea that a man keeping meticulous notes simply stopped noticing for months at a time? Markham had a word for it. Not time travel. He was insistent on that distinction, almost agitated when the journals were read back to him, and the phrase came up. What happened to him, in his own framing, was desynchronization. His personal timeline slipped out of phase with what he called consensus reality. Not ahead of it, not behind it. Beside it, running parallel. Invisible. That word, consensus reality, appears dozens of times across the journals. It implies something unsettling on its own, that what we experience as the present moment is, in some sense, an agreement, a shared frequency, and that the frequency can be broken. The journals describe the subjective experience in detail. He could see everything, people moving through their days, cars, weather changing, seasons cycling, all of it visible to him, apparently in real time. But nothing responded to him. Nothing registered him. He writes that he tried, more than once, to make contact, and nothing happened. Not ignored, not avoided. Simply undetected. As if he had become a ghost in his own timeline, present at the scene of his own disappearance. Watching the years pass from the outside. That closes one question. Where Markham was during the 29 years. He was here, watching, unreachable. But it tears open another one immediately. If desynchronization is a real mechanism, something caused it. And somehow, he came back. How? Coming back is one thing. What he says happened to the people he left behind, that's something else entirely. Markham called it unmemory. Not forgetting, which implies the trace is still there, just buried. Unmemory is his term for the erasure of the cognitive architecture that would allow a memory to form at all. The room where a name would have lived, emptied, not locked, demolished. His claim is that prolonged proximity to the device didn't just fade him from people's minds, it removed the scaffold. The neural structure that would hold a specific person, his voice, his face, the particular weight of knowing him, dissolved while he was still physically present. He wasn't forgotten after he vanished. He was being forgotten while he stood in the room. And here is where the reserved fact lands. Two of his closest neighbors, interviewed independently decades apart, described the person who used to live nearby, in nearly identical terms. A vague sense that someone was there, a general impression of presence, nothing more. No name, no face. Not a single specific interaction. Two people, same erasure, same words, which forces the question Markham himself never fully answers. Is unmemory a metaphor? A way of describing how communities naturally forget the disappeared, the isolated, the quietly vanished, or is he describing something neurological, something ontological, a real mechanism by which a person can be subtracted from the minds of everyone who knew them, the people who knew him before he vanished, his family, his early collaborators, the ones who watched him build the device. What happened to them? That question hasn't been answered yet. The family question sits unanswered, and the journals don't address it directly. What they do contain, in unusual detail, are the schematics. Page after page of technical drawings. Coil geometries, capacitor banks, wiring configurations that fill entire spreads with a precision that feels almost obsessive. Fringe researchers who have managed to photograph specific pages describe the diagrams as occupying a strange middle territory. Real electrical engineering on one hand, components and relationships that appear nowhere in any known literature on the other. The high-voltage architecture is coherent. A trained engineer could follow it. But embedded within that coherent architecture are elements that don't belong to any tradition anyone has been able to source. Whether Markham invented those elements or encountered them somewhere is the question that keeps the diagrams controversial. And then there is this detail, surfaced by one researcher almost as an aside. A specific coil configuration appearing in Markham's drawings, a geometry unusual enough to be distinctive, appears in a 1943 patent application that was never granted and has since been classified. The researcher only found that document because of a separate, entirely unrelated archive search. They weren't looking for Markham. They weren't even looking for high-voltage work. The overlap surfaced on its own. Independent discovery would mean two minds arrived at the same strange configuration decades apart. Leaked knowledge would mean Markham had access to something he shouldn't have. And the third option, that neither explains it, is the one the researcher declined to name out loud. What it does settle, or rather refuses to settle, is whether the device Markham built was something he created or something he found. The third option, the one the researcher declined to name, is where the reality glitch theory begins. Not with Markham's device specifically, with the pattern around it, the classified overlap, the unmemory accounts, the witnesses who remembered and then didn't, the neighbor who saw Markham leave on a Tuesday and has always been certain it was a Tuesday, except every record places that Tuesday on a Wednesday. Small failures, local failures, the kind that only become visible when you line them up. The framework isn't time travel. It doesn't require a portal or a wormhole or any mechanism that moves a person through space-time. What it proposes is simpler, and depending on your tolerance for the idea, considerably more disturbing. That consensus reality, the shared perceptual field that holds events in coherent sequence, can fail. Locally, briefly, in a way that leaves no physical scar. One physicist, speaking anonymously, compared it to a dropped frame in a film. The projector keeps running, the audience keeps watching, but that one frame simply never appears on screen, and no one in the theater ever knows it was missing. Markham, in this reading, wasn't taken somewhere. he was skipped, which opens a harder question than where he went. If a glitch in the shared timeline can remove a person from it, what would it take to put them back? And is restoration even the right word for what happened, or does his return require the same mechanism as his disappearance? That question sits at the center of what no theory has yet explained. Not just the vanishing, but the coming back. And then Markham came back. Whatever the mechanism. Restoration, reinsertion, the same glitch running in reverse, he was present again, in a body, answering questions. Researchers and journalists who reached him in the years following his return described the same quality in his manner, not traumatized exactly. More like a man who had reorganized his understanding of what the word real means and was still living inside that reorganization. The statements he gave were informal. No press conference, no controlled interview, but several independent accounts corroborate the same core claims. He said the isolation was not the worst of it. He said the worst was watching people he had known his entire life walk through him, like he was weather. His phrase, repeated across multiple accounts, walk through him like weather. Not that they ignored him, not that they looked past him, through him. He described it as ceasing to exist for others before ceasing to exist for himself. The social erasure preceding whatever the physical erasure was. That line deserves to sit for a moment, because it opens something difficult. Is Markham describing the metaphorical alienation anyone might feel in a crisis? The loneliness of being unseen? Or is he reporting a literal physical event? That the matter and light which should have registered his presence simply failed to do so? That he cast no shadow, made no sound, displaced no air in a room? The subjective experience of desynchronization, if that is what it was, may be the most irreducibly strange part of this entire account. Whatever happened to the physics, this is what it felt like from inside. That phrase, walk through him like weather, is also, it turns out, exactly the kind of unfalsifiable detail a careful fabricator would choose. It cannot be tested. It cannot be disproven. It lands emotionally and retreats from evidence. A skeptic reading the full Markham account will notice that pattern repeating. Every specific claim that might be checkable dissolves into phenomenology, into subjective texture, into the language of feeling rather than fact. The journals contain no technical specifications that could be independently evaluated. The diagrams describe effects without causes. The timeline of his alleged absence is supported by the absence of records, which is not the same thing as records of absence. The counter theory runs like this. Markham was a man who walked away from his life in 1995, spent 29 years in deliberate obscurity. Not unusual, people do this. And returned with a mythology constructed to be exactly as strange and exactly as unverifiable as it needed to be. The story has the shape of a legend because he built it to have that shape. And the strangest skeptical argument is also the strongest one. If this is a performance, he chose to surface at an age where there is nothing to sell. No book exists. No speaking tour. No monetization of any kind has materialized. Which leaves a question with no clean answer. If this is a hoax, what is it for? And does the absence of obvious motive make the mundane explanation more convincing, or uncomfortably less? So the motive question hangs there, unresolved. And it's exactly the kind of unresolved that makes you want to look somewhere more concrete, somewhere the claim can be tested against something real, which is what researchers did with the journals. The journals themselves are strange objects, not because of their content alone, but because of their structure. Markham did not write linearly. Entries jump between years, sometimes decades. Earlier entries have been annotated in what appears to be the same hand, but with later knowledge folded in, as if he was revising his own past in real time. Handwriting analysts note the ink aging is consistent across annotations that should, by date alone, be years apart. And then there is the entry that stops most researchers cold. A description, in precise detail, the building, the street, the smell of the smoke, of a fire in a small town in eastern Ohio, dated 2 days before that fire occurred. The fire is documented. The town is real. Markham had no known connection to it. There are ordinary explanations. Coincidence, a date written wrong, a page added later. None of them fully satisfy the people who have handled the physical journal and examined the ink under magnification. Which leaves the core question: do the journals contain verifiable evidence of anything genuinely anomalous? Or are they a very carefully constructed record of a very patient man's very long project? The answer depends entirely on what you are willing to rule out. Whether the journals are real or constructed, they force a question that doesn't go away when you set them down. What does it mean for a person to slip out of the shared record entirely? No obituary, no forwarding address, no anchor point in anyone else's memory, and then return claiming the gap was the point. Most disappearances resolve into tragedy or embarrassment. Someone died quietly, or ran from debt, or started over under a different name. The story closes. What makes Markham's case different, whatever its ultimate explanation, is that it refuses to close. The details keep not quite fitting. The timeline keeps not quite lying flat. And then there is what Markham himself said. In one interview, not long after the journal surfaced, he told the person across from him, "I am not warning you about time machines. I am telling you that reality has a tolerance, and most people never get close enough to its edge to notice how thin it actually is." That line does something the diagrams and the ink analysis don't. It relocates the whole story. It stops being about a device in a garage and starts being about a threshold, one that may or may not exist, but that a certain kind of person will always feel drawn toward. Which raises the question underneath every other question in this case. What would it actually take to test whether reality has that tolerance? And would anyone genuinely sane want to find out? Here is what we can say with reasonable confidence. A man appeared in rural Ohio carrying journals that match Markham's documented handwriting. His fingerprints, run against records from the original equipment loans in 1995, came back as a match. His account of the device, the geometry of the coils, the specific frequency that made the first object shimmer, details that were never published, never posted, never accessible to someone reconstructing a hoax from public sources. Those details are either genuine memory or an act of fabrication so committed it has no rational motive. And then there is the last entry in the final journal, a single sentence, written in a hand the analysts confirm is Markham's. Consistent pressure, consistent letter form, the same slight rightward drift on the capital M that appears on page 1 of the earliest notebook. The date at the top of that entry is not in the past. It is 6 months from now. What the sentence says has not been made public. Markham, when asked directly, does not deny knowing what it contains. He does not confirm it either. He says only that some things write themselves before you understand them. So this is where it lands. A man disappeared. 29 years passed. He came back carrying proof that he was who he said, carrying a theory that reframes what consciousness does at the edge of physical law, and carrying one page that hasn't happened yet. Whether he traveled, whether he shifted, whether he simply endured something the rest of us will never have language for, we cannot say. What we can say is that he came back. And whatever threshold he found, he chose to cross it in both directions. That choice is either the most important thing anyone has done in a garage in Ohio, or the most elaborate grief a person can build around a life they once had and couldn't stop reaching for. Maybe those are the same thing.